Idi Amin Dada c. 1925–16 August 2003, was a Ugandan military officer and politician who served as the third president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. He ruled as a military dictator and is considered one of the most brutal despots in modern world history. Amin was born in Koboko in what is now northwest Uganda to a Kakwe father and Lugbara mother. In 1946, he joined the King's African Rifles, KAR, of the British colonial army as a cook. He rose to the rank of lieutenant, taking part in British actions against Somali rebels and then the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. Uganda gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1962, and Amin remained in the army, rising to the position of major and being appointed commander of the Uganda Army in 1965. He became aware that Ugandan President Milton Obote was planning to arrest him for misappropriating army funds, so he launched the 1971 Ugandan coup d'état and declared himself president. During his years in power, Amin shifted from being a pro-Western ruler enjoying considerable support from Israel to being backed by Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, Zaire's Mobutu Sese Seko, the Soviet Union, and East Germany. In 1972, Amin expelled Asians, a majority of whom were Indian Ugandans, leading India to sever diplomatic relations with his regime. In 1975, Amin became the chairman of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, a Pan-Africanist group designed to promote solidarity among African states. Uganda was a member of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights from 1977 to 1979. The United Kingdom broke diplomatic relations with Uganda in 1977, and Amin declared that he had defeated the British and added CBE to his title for Conqueror of the British Empire. As Amin's rule progressed into the late 1970s, there was increased unrest against his persecution of certain ethnic groups and political dissidents, along with Uganda's very poor international standing due to Amin's support for the terrorist hijackers in Operation Entebbe. He then attempted to annex Tanzania's Kagera region in 1978. The Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere ordered his troops to invade Uganda in response. Tanzanian army and rebel forces successfully captured Kampala in 1979 and ousted Amin from power. Amin went into exile, first in Libya, then Iraq, and finally in Saudi Arabia, where he lived until his death in 2003. Amin's rule was characterized by rampant human rights abuses, including political repression, ethnic persecution, extrajudicial killings, as well as nepotism, corruption, and gross economic mismanagement. International observers and human rights groups estimate that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed under his regime. Amin joined an Islamic school in Bombo in 1941. After a few years, he left school with only a fourth-grade English language education and did odd jobs before being recruited to the army by a British colonial army officer. Amin joined the British King's African Rifles, KAR, in 1946 as an assistant cook, while at the same time receiving military training until 1947. In later life he falsely claimed to have served in the Burma campaign of World War II. He was transferred to Kenya for infantry service as a private in 1947, and served in the 21st KAR Infantry Battalion in Gilgil, Kenya Colony until 1949. That year, his unit was deployed to northern Kenya to fight against Somali rebels. In 1952, his brigade was deployed against the Mau Mau rebels in Kenya. He was promoted to corporal the same year, then to sergeant in 1953. In 1959, Amin was made Effendi Class II, Warrant Officer, the highest rank possible for a black African in the colonial British military of that time. Amin returned to Uganda the same year and received a short service commission as a lieutenant on July 15, 1961, becoming one of the first two Ugandans to become commissioned officers. He was assigned to quell the cattle rustling between Uganda's Karamohong and Kenya's Turkana nomads. According to researcher Holger Berndt Hansen, Amin's outlook, behavior, and strategies of communication were strongly influenced by his experiences in the colonial military. This included his direct and hands-on leadership style, which would eventually contribute to his popularity among certain parts of Ugandan society. In 1962, following Uganda's independence from the United Kingdom, Amin was promoted to captain and then, in 1963, to major. He was appointed deputy commander of the army in 1964 and, the following year, to commander of the army. In 1970, he was promoted to commander of all the armed forces. Amin was an athlete during his time in both the British and Uganda Army. At 1.93 m, 6 feet 4 in, tall and powerfully built, he was the Ugandan light heavyweight boxing champion from 1951 to 1960, as well as a swimmer. Amin was also a formidable rugby forward, although one officer said of him, "Idi Amin is a splendid type and a good rugby player, but virtually bone from the neck up, and needs things explained in words of one letter." In the 1950s, he played for Nile RFC. There is a frequently repeated urban myth that he was selected as a replacement by the East Africa Rugby Union team for their 1955 tour match against the British Lions. Amin, however, does not appear in the team photograph or on the official team list. Following conversations with a colleague in the military, Amin became a fan of Hayes FC, an affection that remained for the rest of his life. In 1965, Prime Minister Milton Obote and Amin were implicated in a deal to smuggle ivory and gold into Uganda from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The deal, as later alleged by General Nicholas Olenga, an associate of the former Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, was part of an arrangement to help troops opposed to the Congolese government trade ivory and gold for arms supplies secretly smuggled to them by Amin. In 1966, the Ugandan parliament demanded an investigation. Obote imposed a new constitution abolishing the ceremonial presidency held by Kagera, King, Mutsa II of Buganda, and declared himself executive president. He promoted Amin to colonel and army commander. Amin led an attack on the Kagera's palace and forced Mutsa into exile to the United Kingdom, where he remained until his death in 1969. Amin began recruiting members of Kakwe, Lugbara, South Sudanese, and other ethnic groups from the West Nile area bordering South Sudan. The South Sudanese had been residents in Uganda since the early 20th century, having come from South Sudan to serve the colonial army. Many African ethnic groups in northern Uganda inhabit both Uganda and South Sudan. Allegations persist that Amin's army consisted mainly of South Sudanese soldiers. Eventually a rift developed between Amin and Obote, exacerbated by the support Amin had built within the Uganda army by recruiting from the West Nile region, his involvement in operations to support the rebellion in southern Sudan, and an attempt on Obote's life in 1969. In October 1970, Obote took control of the armed forces, reducing Amin from his months-old post of commander of all the armed forces to that of the commander of the Uganda army. Having learned that Obote was planning to arrest him for misappropriating army funds, Amin seized power in a military coup with the assistance of Israeli government agents on January 25, 1971, while Obote was attending a Commonwealth Summit meeting in Singapore. Troops loyal to Amin sealed off Entebbe International Airport and took Kampala. Soldiers surrounded Obote's residence and blocked major roads. A broadcast on Radio Uganda accused Obote's government of corruption and preferential treatment of the Lango region. Cheering crowds were reported in the streets of Kampala after the radio broadcast. Amin, who presented himself a soldier, not a politician, declared that the military government would remain only as a caretaker regime until new elections, which would be held when the situation was normalized. He promised to release all political prisoners. Amin held a state funeral in April 1971 for Edward Mutsa, former king, Kagera, of Buganda and president who had died in exile. On February 2, 1971, 1 week after the coup, Amin declared himself president of Uganda, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Uganda Army Chief of Staff, and Chief of Air Staff. He suspended certain provisions of the Ugandan constitution, and soon instituted an advisory defense council composed of military officers with himself as the chairman. Amin placed military tribunals above the system of civil law, appointed soldiers to top government posts and government-owned corporations, and informed the newly inducted civilian cabinet ministers that they would be subject to military courtesy. Amin ruled by decree. Over the course of his rule he issued approximately 30 decrees. Amin renamed the presidential lodge in Kampala from Government House to the Command Post. He disbanded the General Service Unit, GSU, an intelligence agency created by the previous government, and replaced it with the State Research Bureau, SRB. SRB headquarters at the Kampala suburb of Nakasero became the scene of torture and capital punishment over the next few years. Other agencies used to persecute dissenters included the Military Police and the Public Safety Unit, PSU. Obote took refuge in Tanzania, having been offered sanctuary there by the Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere. Obote was soon joined by 20,000 Ugandan refugees fleeing Amin. The exiles attempted but failed to regain Uganda in 1972, through a poorly organized coup attempt. In January 1977 Amin appointed General Mustafa Idrissi Vice President of Uganda. That year, a split in the Uganda army developed between supporters of Amin and soldiers loyal to Idrissi, who held significant power in the government and wanted to purge foreigners, particularly Sudanese, from the military. The growing dissatisfaction in the Uganda army was reflected by frequent coup attempts. Amin was even wounded during one of them, namely Operation Mafuta Minji in June 1977. By 1978, the number of Amin's supporters and close associates had shrunk significantly, and he faced increasing dissent from the populace within Uganda as the economy and infrastructure collapsed as a result of the years of neglect and abuse. After the killings of Bishop Lwam and ministers Oriema and Obote Fumbai in 1977, several of Amin's ministers defected or fled into exile. In early 1978, Idrissi was severely injured in a car accident and flown to Cairo for treatment. While he was there, Amin stripped him of his positions as Minister of Defense and Minister of Home Affairs and denounced him for retiring senior prison officials without his knowledge. Amin then proceeded to purge several high-ranking officials from his government and took personal control of several ministerial portfolios. The shake-up caused political unrest and especially angered Idrissi's followers, who believed that the car accident was a failed assassination attempt. In November 1978, troops loyal to Idrissi mutinied. Amin sent troops against the mutineers, some of whom had fled across the Tanzanian border. Fighting consequently broke out along that border, and the Uganda army invaded Tanzanian territory under unclear circumstances. According to several experts and politicians, Amin directly ordered the invasion in an attempt to distract the Ugandan military and public from the crisis at home. Other accounts suggest, however, that Amin had lost control of parts of the Uganda army, so Amin's sanction for the invasion was a post facto action to save face regarding troops who had acted without his orders. In any case, Amin accused Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere of initiating the war against Uganda after the hostilities had erupted, and proclaimed the annexation of a section of Kagera when the Ugandan invasion initially proved to be successful. However, as Tanzania began to prepare a counter-offensive, Amin reportedly realized his precarious situation, and attempted to defuse the conflict without losing face. The Ugandan president publicly suggested that he and Nyerere participate in a boxing match which, in lieu of military action, would determine the outcome of the conflict. Nyerere ignored the message. In January 1979, Nyerere mobilized the Tanzania People's Defense Force and counterattacked, joined by several groups of Ugandan exiles who had united as the Uganda National Liberation Army, UNLA. Amin's army retreated steadily, despite military help from Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. The president reportedly made several trips abroad to other countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iraq during the war, attempting to enlist more foreign support. He made few public appearances in the final months of his rule, but spoke frequently on radio and television. Following a major defeat in the Battle of Lokaya, parts of the Uganda Army Command reportedly urged Amin to step down. He angrily refused and declared, "If you don't want to fight, I'll do it myself." He consequently fired Chief of Staff Yusuf Gowon. However, Amin was forced to flee the Ugandan capital by helicopter on April 11, 1979, when Kampala was captured. After a short-lived attempt to rally some remnants of the Uganda army in eastern Uganda, which reportedly included Amin proclaiming the city of Jinja his country's new capital, he fled into exile. Amin first escaped to Libya, where he stayed until 1980, and ultimately settled in Saudi Arabia, where the Saudi royal family allowed him sanctuary and paid him a generous subsidy in return for staying out of politics. Amin lived for a number of years on the top 2 floors of the Novotel Hotel on Palestine Road in Jeddah. Brian Barron, who covered the Uganda, Tanzania war for the BBC as chief Africa correspondent, together with cameraman Mohammed Amin, no relation, of Vice News in Nairobi, located Amin on June 4, 1980, and secured the first interview with him since his deposition. While in exile, Amin funded remnants of his army that fought in the Ugandan Bush War. Though he continued to be a controversial figure, some of Amin's former followers as well as several rebel groups continued to fight in his name for decades, and occasionally advocated for his amnesty and even his restoration to Ugandan presidency. During interviews he gave during his exile in Saudi Arabia, Amin held that Uganda needed him, and never expressed remorse for the brutal nature of his regime. In January 1989, Amin left his exile without authorization by the Saudi Arabian government and flew alongside one of his sons to Zaire. There, he intended to mobilize a rebel force to reconquer Uganda, which was engulfed in another civil war at the time. The rest of his family stayed in Jeddah. Despite using a false Zairene passport, Amin was easily recognized upon arriving with Air Zaire at Njili Airport, and promptly arrested by Zairene security forces. The Zairene government reacted unfavorably to Amin's arrival, and attempted to expel him from the country. At first, Saudi Arabia refused to allow him to return, as its government was deeply offended that he had abused their hospitality by leaving without permission. The Zairene government wanted neither to extradite Amin to Uganda, where the ex-president faced murder charges, nor keep him in Zaire, thereby straining international relations. As a result, Amin was initially expelled to Senegal, from where he was supposed to be sent to Saudi Arabia, but the Senegalese government sent him back to Zaire when Saudi Arabia continued to refuse Amin a visa. Following appeals by Moroccan King Hassan II, the Saudi Arabian government finally relented and allowed Amin to return. In return, Amin had to promise to never again participate in any political or military activities, nor give interviews. He consequently spent the remainder of his life in Saudi Arabia. In the final years of his life, Amin reportedly ate a fruitarian diet. His daily consumption of oranges earned him the nickname Dr. Jaffa among Saudi Arabians. On July 19, 2003, Amin's fourth wife, Nalongo Madina, reported that he was in a coma and near death at the King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, from kidney failure. She pleaded with the Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, to allow him to return to Uganda for the remainder of his life. Museveni replied that Amin would have to answer for his sins the moment he was brought back. 118 Amin's family eventually decided to disconnect life support, and Amin consequently died at the hospital in Jeddah on August 16, 2003. He was buried in Ruwais Cemetery in Jeddah in a simple grave, without any fanfare. After Amin's death, David Owen revealed that during his term as the British Foreign Secretary, 1977 to 1979, he had proposed having Amin assassinated. He has defended this, arguing, "I'm not ashamed of considering it, because his regime goes down in the scale of Pol Pot as one of the worst of all African regimes." A polygamist, Idi Amin married at least 6 women, 3 of whom he divorced. He married his first and second wives, Malyamua and Kay, in 1966. In 1967, he married Nora, and then married Nalongo Madina in 1972. On March 26, 1974, he announced on Radio Uganda that he had divorced Malyamua, Nora, and K. Malyamua was arrested in Tororo on the Kenyan border in April 1974 and accused of attempting to smuggle a bolt of fabric into Kenya. In 1974, K. Amin died under mysterious circumstances, with her body found dismembered. Nora fled to Zaire in 1979, her current whereabouts are unknown. In July 1975, Amin staged a £2 million wedding to 19-year-old Sarah Kuleba, a go-go dancer with the Revolutionary Suicide Mechanized Regiment Band, nicknamed Suicide Sarah. The wedding was held during the Organization of African Unity, OAU, summit meeting in Kampala, and the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, served as Amin's best man. Before she met Amin, Sarah was living with a boyfriend, Jesse Gitta. He vanished and it is not clear if he was beheaded, or detained after fleeing to Kenya. The couple had 4 children and enjoyed rally race driving Amin's Citroën SM, with Sarah as navigator. Sarah was a hairdresser in Tottenham when she died in 2015. By 1993, Amin was living with the last 9 of his children and one wife, Mama Akumaru, the mother of the youngest 4 of his children. His last known child, daughter Iman, was born in 1992. According to the Monitor, Amin married again a few months before his death in 2003, and converted to Islam during his exile. Amin fathered as many as 60 children. Until 2003, Taban Amin, born 1955, Idi Amin's eldest son, was the leader of West Nile Bank Front, WNBF, a rebel group opposed to the government of Yoweri Museveni. In 2005, he was offered amnesty by Museveni, and in 2006, he was appointed Deputy Director General of the Internal Security Organization. Another of Amin's sons, Haji Ali Amin, ran for election as chairman, i.e. mayor, of Njuru Town Council in 2002 but was not elected. Sarah Kuleba's third child, Faisal Wanjita, born in 1983 in Uganda, according to himself born in 1981 in Saudi Arabia, was involved in a brutal gang murder in Camden, North London, in 2006. In connection with this, he was sentenced to 5 years detention in 2007, for conspiracy to wound, conspiracy to possess offensive weapons and violent disorder. He had been convicted for possession of offensive weapons, theft, and fraud in the years before. In early 2007, the award-winning film The Last King of Scotland prompted one of his sons, Jafar Amin, born in 1967, to speak out in his father's defense. Jafar Amin said he was writing a book to rehabilitate his father's reputation. Jafar is the 10th of Amin's 40 official children by 7 official wives. Among Amin's closest associates was the Briton Bob Astles. Isaac Malia Mungu was an instrumental affiliate and one of the more feared officers in Amin's army. Gender historian Alicia Decker wrote that the deeply embedded culture of militarism in Uganda is undoubtedly Amin's most enduring legacy. His reputation in Uganda has been viewed over the decades following his rule in more complex ways than in the international community. Some Ugandans have praised him as a patriot and supported his decision to expel Asians from the country. At the time of his death, he was particularly well regarded in northwestern Uganda. One of Amin's sons, Jafar Remo, criticized the negative public perception of his father and called for a commission to investigate the veracity of the abuses committed under his rule. Thank you for watching this video.